Quit, and I will make sure no one in this city ever hires you again." That was the first thing my cold, untouchable CEO said to me after kissing me in front of 300 people and about 20 flashing cameras. And the worst part was, I believed him. My name is Jamie Parker, and 3 hours before that moment, I was just another invisible employee standing in a ballroom I had absolutely no business being in, clutching a glass of champagne I couldn't pronounce and trying not to spill it on the marble floor that probably cost more than my entire student loan debt. The Cross Enterprises annual gala was the kind of event where everyone looked like they stepped out of a magazine, where suits were tailored within an inch of perfection and laughter sounded expensive. And then there was me, adjusting a thrift store blazer that fit like a bad decision and reminding myself to breathe normally like I belonged here. I didn't. I was only there because my boss insisted someone from our department had to show face, which was corporate speak for stand quietly and don't embarrass us. And I had every intention of doing exactly that, stay in the corner, collect a few quotes, and leave before anyone important noticed I existed. That plan worked perfectly for about 12 minutes, right up until the room shifted in a way I didn't understand at first, like the air itself tightened, conversations lowering just a fraction, eyes subtly redirecting toward the center of the room, and that's when I saw him. Nathaniel Cross, CEO, Human Ice Sculpture. The kind of man people described in headlines as ruthless, brilliant, and impossible to read. And in person, he was worse, taller than I expected, shoulders sharp beneath a perfectly cut suit, dark hair styled with effortless precision, and eyes that didn't just look at people, they assessed them, like a problem waiting to be solved or eliminated. I had never spoken to him, never even been within 10 feet of him before, and yet somehow, in a room full of influential investors and social elites, his gaze cut through everything and landed on me like I'd done something wrong just by existing. I looked away immediately, obviously, because that's what a normal person does when a man like that looks at you. Panic internally and pretend you're fascinated by a decorative plant. But the problem was, he didn't look away. If anything, I could feel it, that subtle pressure of attention, like standing too close to a storm you didn't realize was forming until it was already too late to move. And then things escalated. Voices sharpened near him, tension rippling through the cluster of executives around him. Something about a deal, a rumor, a threat. I couldn't hear clearly, but I didn't need to. Whatever was happening, it wasn't good, and I told myself to stay out of it, to step back, to disappear like I was supposed to. But that's when he moved. 1 second he was across the room. The next he was walking straight toward me. Long strides, focused, deliberate, and my brain did that very helpful thing where it stopped working entirely. There was no warning, no explanation, just his hand on my shoulder, firm, grounding, like he'd already decided something I hadn't been informed about. And then he leaned in close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my ear as he said, low and controlled, "Play along." Before I could ask what that meant, before I could even process the fact that the CEO was speaking to me at all, his hand slid to the small of my back, pulling me closer, and then his lips were on mine. Not rushed, not careless, intentional, precise, like it was part of a plan I didn't understand but was now trapped inside. The room disappeared for a split second, replaced by the shock of it, the warmth, the sheer impossibility of what was happening, and then it all came crashing back at once. Gasps, whispers, the unmistakable sound of cameras clicking like a storm breaking overhead. When he pulled back, just slightly, his expression was already composed again, unreadable, as if nothing had happened at all, as if he hadn't just rewritten my entire life in front of everyone. "Smile," he murmured, barely moving his lips. And like an idiot, I did. The moment the cameras started flashing, reality snapped back into place like a rubber band against my brain, sharp and immediate, and I realized two very important things at once. First, every single person in that ballroom was staring at me, and second, I had just kissed the most powerful man in the building and had absolutely no idea why. My smile froze in place, painfully stiff, like my face had forgotten how to function, while Nathaniel's hand remained at my lower back, steady and possessive in a way that made it look natural, like this was something we had done 100 times before instead of a complete and utter disaster unfolding in real time. "Relax," he murmured under his breath, his voice calm, controlled, completely unaffected, which was impressive considering my heart was currently attempting to escape my body at approximately 100 miles per hour. Relax. Right. I was standing in a room full of executives and investors, being photographed as the apparent romantic partner of a man I had never even had a proper conversation with, and he wanted me to relax. That made sense. Perfect sense. I nodded anyway because apparently I had lost all ability to make rational decisions. And when someone nearby cleared their throat and stepped closer, Nathaniel shifted just slightly, his fingers pressing a fraction firmer against my side, as if to anchor me there, as if leaving was not an option I was allowed to consider. Nathaniel, a sharply dressed man said, his tone carefully neutral but edged with something else, something assessing. You never mentioned you were bringing someone. I opened my mouth, ready to correct the entire situation before it spiraled any further, but Nathaniel spoke first. Of course he did. I do not discuss my personal life in boardrooms, he replied smoothly, his voice carrying just enough warmth to sound intentional, just enough distance to remain untouchable. And then, to my absolute horror, his gaze dropped briefly to my face, softening in a way that felt dangerously convincing. Jamie prefers it that way. Jamie prefers it that way. I almost choked on my own existence. Instead, I forced out a small, polite laugh that sounded like it belonged to someone else entirely and nodded again, because clearly nodding was my new personality. Yes, I said, somehow managing to speak without my voice cracking. I like to keep things private. Private. Right. Nothing about this was private anymore. The man in front of us studied me for a moment longer, like he was trying to decide if I was real or just another strategic move, and I could feel the weight of that scrutiny settling on my shoulders, heavy and uncomfortable, but Nathaniel did not let it linger. He guided the conversation away with practiced ease, one hand still at my back, his presence controlling the entire interaction like he was orchestrating a performance only he understood. And I was part of it now, whether I liked it or not. The next 10 minutes blurred together into a series of introductions, handshakes, and polite smiles that I barely processed, my brain stuck somewhere between shock and disbelief, repeating the same question over and over again. What just happened? Every time I tried to step back, to create even a few inches of distance, Nathaniel's hand would shift slightly, subtle but firm, keeping me exactly where he wanted me, close enough to maintain the illusion, close enough that anyone watching would assume this was real. And the worst part was, he was good at it. Effortlessly good. The way he spoke, the way he glanced at me at just the right moments, the way his thumb brushed lightly against my side once, just enough to sell the image without drawing attention to it. It all felt calculated, precise, like every movement had a purpose I was not aware of. By the time the conversation finally ended and the crowd shifted again, I was barely holding it together. I waited exactly 3 seconds before stepping back, finally breaking the contact, the absence of his hand almost startling after how constant it had been, and I turned to him, lowering my voice as much as possible while every instinct in my body screamed. What was that? I whispered, my words tight, controlled, one step away from completely losing it. And why am I suddenly part of it? He did not answer immediately. Of course he did not. Nathaniel Cross never did anything immediately. He simply looked at me, those unreadable eyes taking in every detail, like he was deciding something again, recalculating, adjusting. And then he said, quietly, evenly, "You just solved a problem for me." That was not an explanation. That was not even close to an explanation. I stared at him, waiting for the rest, waiting for anything that resembled logic. But all he did was straighten his cuff, smooth, composed, as if he had not just dragged me into the center of a situation I did not understand. And now, he added, his gaze returning to mine with that same calm certainty, "You are going to help me finish it." My stomach dropped. Because something in the way he said it made it very clear this was not a request. For a second, I honestly thought I had misheard him, because there was no reasonable universe where I would willingly agree to help him with whatever this was. And yet the way he said it made it sound less like an option and more like a conclusion that had already been decided. "Help you finish what exactly?" I asked, keeping my voice low but firm, the kind of controlled tone you use when you are trying very hard not to panic in public while your entire life is quietly unraveling in the background. Nathaniel's gaze did not waver, not even a fraction. like he was measuring my reaction, cataloging it, filing it away for later use. And then he did something that should not have affected me at all, but somehow did anyway. He stepped closer. Not enough to draw attention, not enough to look inappropriate, just enough to close the small gap I had created when I stepped back. Just enough that anyone watching would assume we were still exactly what he wanted them to believe we were. "You understand what people just saw," he said, his voice calm, almost conversational, but there was something underneath it, something deliberate, something that made my stomach tighten. "They will not question it. They will not investigate it. They will accept it." I blinked at him, my brain trying to catch up with the speed of his logic. "Accept what?" I asked, even though I was already starting to piece it together, already starting to realize where this was going, and I did not like it. Not even a little. His expression did not change. "That you are with me," he said simply. That sentence hit harder than it should have. Maybe because of how easily he said it. Maybe because of how completely he expected it to be true. I let out a short, disbelieving breath, shaking my head as I took another step back, this time more deliberately. "No," I said immediately, because that was the only reasonable response. "Absolutely not. You do not get to just decide that I am suddenly your whatever that was supposed to be." The word did not even exist in my vocabulary right now. Boyfriend, partner, public distraction. None of them felt right, and all of them felt dangerous. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, not irritation, not surprise, just a subtle shift, like he had expected resistance and was already prepared to counter it. Of course he was. "This is temporary," he said, as if that made everything better, as if that erased the fact that he had just turned me into a headline without my consent. "There is a narrative forming tonight. If it continues unchecked, it will damage the company. What you and I just did redirected it. Redirected it. Like I was not a person, just a tool he had picked up and used because it was convenient." My hands curled slightly at my sides, frustration building in my chest, sharp and immediate. "You kissed me," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "Without asking. In front of everyone. And now you are telling me I have to go along with it because it helps your company." When I said it out loud, it sounded even more ridiculous. His gaze held mine, steady, unflinching. Yes. That was it. No apology. No hesitation. Just yes. I stared at him, waiting for the part where he realized how insane that sounded, but it never came. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying me like I was a problem he had not fully solved yet. "You have two choices," he continued, his tone still even, still controlled, like we were discussing something minor instead of the complete takeover of my personal life. "You can walk away now, create confusion, invite scrutiny, and turn this into something far more complicated than it needs to be." My heart sank a little at that, because I already knew where the second option was going. Of course I did. "Or," he added, just slightly softer, but somehow more dangerous, "you can stay, follow my lead, and this ends cleanly." Ends cleanly, like it had not already exploded. I let out a breath, running a hand through my hair, trying to think, trying to find the logic in a situation that had none. "And what happens after it ends?" I asked, my voice quieter now, more cautious, because this was the part that mattered. This was the part that would decide everything. Nathaniel watched me for a long second, and for the first time since this started, there was a pause. A real one. Then he said, "That depends. On you." And somehow, that answer was worse than anything else he had said so far. The silence between us stretched just long enough to make everything feel heavier than it already was, like the entire room had faded into the background, and it was just me and him standing in the middle of something I did not agree to, but somehow could not walk away from either. "That is not an answer," I said finally, my voice quieter now but sharper, because if he thought he could corner me into this without a clear exit, he was wrong. Or at least, I needed to believe he was wrong. Nathaniel did not react immediately, which was quickly becoming a pattern I hated, and instead of responding, he reached for a passing server's tray, taking a glass of champagne with the kind of effortless precision that made everything he did look intentional. He handed it to me without asking, his fingers brushing briefly against mine, not lingering, not inappropriate, just enough to remind me that he was still standing too close, still controlling the space between us. "Drink," he said calmly, like that was the most important part of this conversation. I stared at the glass for half a second, debating whether throwing it at him would solve any of my current problems, and then took it anyway, because causing a scene would only make things worse. I hated that he was right about that. I took a small sip, more for something to do than anything else, and when I looked back at him, he was already watching me again, like he had been the entire time. You said this ends cleanly. I reminded him, refusing to let him redirect the conversation completely. So explain it to me. When does it end? How does it end? And why exactly am I the one stuck in the middle of it? This time, he answered without delay. 6 weeks, he said. 6 weeks. The number hit me immediately, precise, calculated, like he had already planned this far ahead before I had even realized I was part of it. We maintained the narrative for 6 weeks. Public appearances. Consistent behavior. No contradictions. His tone was matter of fact, like he was outlining a business strategy, not constructing a temporary version of my life without my permission. And then, he continued, we separate. Quietly. No conflict. No speculation. I let out a short breath, staring at him like he had just suggested something completely reasonable, like this was a normal thing people did on a regular basis. You want me to pretend to be your partner, I said slowly, making sure I understood every part of this before I even considered responding. For 6 weeks, in front of the public, the company, and apparently everyone with a camera, and then just walk away like nothing happened. Yes. Of course it was that simple to him. I laughed once, a soft, disbelieving sound that did nothing to ease the tension building in my chest. And you think that is not going to affect my actual life? I added, because that part seemed incredibly important and somehow completely overlooked in his plan. My job, my reputation, the fact that I will be known as the person who was suddenly involved with the CEO and then just disappeared from that role. His gaze did not waver. Your position will not be compromised, he said. If anything, it will be protected. Protected. The word landed strangely, like it did not quite fit, but still carried weight. I frowned slightly, trying to understand what he meant, but before I could ask, he added, no one in this company will question you. No one will undermine you. Not while you are associated with me. That was not reassurance. That was leverage. I could feel it, the way he framed it, the way it sounded less like a benefit and more like a controlled environment he was placing me in. I set the glass down on the nearest table, my hands suddenly too restless to hold anything steady. And what if I say no? I asked, meeting his eyes again, because I needed to hear him say it. I needed to know exactly how far he was willing to go to make this happen. For a moment, nothing changed. His expression remained composed, his posture relaxed, like he had all the time in the world. And then, very slightly, his gaze sharpened. Then you walk away, he said. My chest loosened just a fraction at that, relief flickering too soon, too fast, because something about the way he said it felt incomplete. And then he finished the sentence. And you deal with everything that follows. There it was. Not a threat. Not directly. But close enough that I understood it anyway. The headlines. The questions. The assumptions. The attention I never asked for and would not know how to handle alone. I swallowed, my confidence slipping just enough to be noticeable, and I hated that he saw it. Of course he did. Nathaniel Cross missed nothing. He stepped closer again, just slightly, lowering his voice so that only I could hear him. Or, he said quietly, you let me control the narrative, and this becomes something you can survive. Survive. That word should not have made sense. But somehow it did. The word survive echoed in my head longer than it should have, settling somewhere uncomfortable, somewhere too close to the truth I did not want to admit. Because he was right, and I hated that more than anything. I hated that he had already calculated every angle of this situation while I was still trying to figure out how I had even ended up in it. I exhaled slowly, looking away for a moment, just long enough to gather something that resembled control, but it felt thin, fragile, like it could snap at any second. You make it sound like I do not have a real choice, I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. Because if I was going to be trapped in this conversation, I was not going to let him see how much it was affecting me. Nathaniel did not deny it. Of course he did not. He simply watched me, that same calm, unreadable expression in place, like this was exactly where he expected me to be. You have a choice, he said, and for a second, it almost sounded genuine, almost reasonable, until he added, you just do not like the outcomes. That was not the same thing. Not even close. I let out a breath that felt heavier than it should have, my mind running through every possible scenario, every version of what would happen if I walked away versus what would happen if I stayed, and none of them felt good. Not a single one. But one of them felt controlled, predictable, and the other felt like stepping into a storm without knowing how bad it was going to get. I hated that I was even considering this. I hated that he had put me in a position where considering it made sense. 6 weeks, I repeated, more to myself than to him, testing the weight of it, the reality of it, and it sounded absurd every time I said it, like something out of a script instead of my actual life. 6 weeks of pretending. 6 weeks of being watched. 6 weeks of standing next to a man who could dismantle my entire career with a single decision. My chest tightened slightly at that thought, and I forced myself to focus, to stay grounded in the only thing that mattered right now. Control. If I was going to agree to this, I needed some of it back. Even a little. I turned back to him, meeting his gaze directly this time, refusing to look away first. If I do this, I said carefully, choosing each word with intention, there are rules. That got his attention. Not visibly, not dramatically, but I saw it, the subtle shift, the slight narrowing of his focus, like he was recalibrating again, adjusting his expectations. You do not get to make decisions for me without telling me. I continued, my voice firm now, steadier, stronger, because this was the line I was drawing whether he liked it or not. No more surprises like what just happened. If I am part of this, I know what I am walking into before it happens. For a moment, he said nothing, and I held my ground, refusing to fill the silence for him, refusing to back down now that I had started. Finally, he inclined his head slightly, a small, controlled acknowledgement. Agreed, he said. That was easier than I expected, which immediately made me suspicious, but I did not have time to unpack that right now. And, I added quickly, before he could take control of the conversation again, this does not affect my actual work. I do my job the same way I always have. No special treatment. No interference. His expression remained neutral, but there was something in his eyes now, something sharper, more focused, like he was paying closer attention than before. You will have autonomy in your role, he said, which was not exactly what I asked for, but close enough that I could work with it. Close enough that I could pretend this was still my life. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough to feel the weight of what I was about to do, the decision that would change everything for the next 6 weeks whether I was ready or not. I was not ready. Not even close. But I also knew I was not walking away. Not from this. Not with everything already in motion. I swallowed, forcing the words out before I could stop myself. Fine, I said, the agreement settling in my chest like something heavy and permanent. 6 weeks. The moment the words left my mouth, something shifted. Not in the room. Not in the crowd around us. In him. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I felt it. The way his posture adjusted just slightly, the way his presence seemed to settle, like a decision had been finalized, like a contract had been signed without paper or ink. Good, he said, his voice quieter now, but no less certain. And then, without warning, his hand returned to my back, warm, steady, guiding me gently but firmly back toward the center of the room. Then stay close, he added under his breath. People are watching. And just like that, I realized something I should have understood from the beginning. This had already started. The moment he said people are watching, I became painfully aware of everything at once. The subtle shift of eyes in our direction, the way conversations paused just a fraction too long when we passed, the quiet curiosity wrapped in polite smiles that were not nearly as subtle as people thought they were, and suddenly every step I took felt deliberate, measured, like I had to think about where my hands were, how I stood, whether I was too close or not close enough. And the worst part was I did not even know what the correct answer was supposed to be. Nathaniel, of course, did. He always did. His hand remained at my back, steady, not forceful but firm enough that I could feel the direction he wanted me to move, guiding me through the room with a quiet confidence that made it look effortless, natural, like we had done this before, like this was normal for us, and I hated how convincing it was. Relax your shoulders, he murmured under his breath as we approached another group of executives, his voice low enough that no one else could hear it, but close enough that I felt it more than I heard it. I stiffened immediately. Of course I did. Which, apparently, was the wrong reaction. Not that much, he added, and I caught the faintest hint of something that almost sounded like amusement, which made absolutely no sense because there was nothing amusing about this situation. I adjusted, forcing myself to loosen up just slightly, trying to mirror the ease in his posture, the way he carried himself like nothing could touch him, like he was completely in control of everything around him. I was very much not in control. Not of this. Not of my heartbeat that refused to slow down. Not of the fact that every time his hand shifted even slightly, I noticed it immediately, like my brain had decided to hyper-focus on every small point of contact whether I wanted it to or not. Good, he said quietly, almost to himself, and for some reason, that single word hit harder than it should have, like approval I did not ask for, but still reacted to anyway. I ignored that. Completely. Focus. That was the goal. Focus on surviving the next 5 minutes without doing anything that would make this situation worse than it already was. Nathaniel, someone greeted as we stepped into another conversation, and just like that, the performance continued. His demeanor shifted almost imperceptibly, his expression softening just enough to appear approachable without losing that sharp edge of authority, and I realized this was not just instinct for him. This was skill. Practiced. Perfected. Dangerous. You have been keeping secrets, the woman added with a knowing smile, her gaze flicking between us in a way that made it very clear she had already formed her own conclusions. I resisted the urge to correct her again, because apparently that was no longer an option I was allowed to take without consequences. Instead, I did exactly what he told me to do. I followed his lead. His thumb brushed lightly against my side again, subtle, brief, but enough to ground the image. Enough to reinforce whatever story people were building in their heads, and when I glanced up at him, just for a second, his eyes were already on me, steady, focused, like he was checking, adjusting, making sure I was still where he needed me to be. That look lingered a fraction longer than necessary, and then it was gone. The conversation moved forward, business talk, layered with polite curiosity, and I answered when I was expected to, careful, measured, keeping my responses neutral but believable, trying not to overthink every word that came out of my mouth, which was nearly impossible given the circumstances. Time stretched in a strange way, every minute feeling longer than it should, every interaction adding another layer to the situation I had just agreed to without fully understanding it. 6 weeks. The number echoed again, heavier now, more real, and I wondered how something that sounded temporary could already feel this permanent. By the time the conversation ended and we stepped away again, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical energy and everything to do with maintaining something that was not real but had to look like it was. I exhaled quietly, barely noticeable, but Nathaniel noticed anyway. Of course he did. You are overthinking, he said, his tone calm, almost casual, like we were discussing something simple instead of the fact that I was currently pretending to be involved with him in front of half the city's most influential people. I glanced at him, unable to stop myself. That tends to happen when my life changes in the span of 10 minutes. I replied under my breath, my words sharper than intended but not entirely untrue. For a moment, he did not respond, and I thought maybe, just maybe, I had pushed too far, but then he did something unexpected. His hand shifted slightly, not guiding this time, not controlling, just resting there for a second longer than necessary, steady, almost reassuring. Then keep up, he said quietly, his gaze forward, unreadable as ever. And somehow, that felt less like a warning and more like a promise. By the time we reached the edge of the ballroom again, the noise had dulled into something distant, like my brain had decided to filter out anything that was not immediately relevant to survival, which at this point meant keeping up with him and not collapsing under the pressure of pretending this was normal. It was not normal. None of this was normal. And yet, from the outside, it looked seamless, effortless, like we belonged exactly where we were. We are leaving in 5 minutes, Nathaniel said quietly, his voice cutting through my thoughts with that same calm certainty, like he had already planned the next move before I even realized there was one. I blinked at him, trying to recalibrate. Leaving, I repeated, because that sounded too good to be true, like an escape I had not been expecting this soon. Yes, he replied simply, his gaze scanning the room briefly before returning to me. The narrative has been established. Staying longer increases the risk of inconsistency. Of course it did. Of course, he had already calculated the exact amount of time required to make this believable without overexposing it. I should have expected that by now. And what happens after we leave? I asked, lowering my voice again, because every answer he gave seemed to lead to 3 more questions I was not prepared for. His expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, like he was transitioning from one phase of this plan to the next. "You come with me," he said. That was not the answer I was hoping for. Not even close. "Come with you where?" I asked immediately, because there was no version of this where I blindly followed him into another situation without understanding it first. I had already made that mistake once tonight. He held my gaze for a second, assessing, measuring, and then he said, "My car." That somehow did not make it better. If anything, it made it worse. My brain immediately supplied several reasons why getting into a car with my CEO after he had just turned my life into a public storyline was not a great idea, and I opened my mouth to object, to push back, to establish at least one boundary before things spiraled even further, but he spoke again before I could. "You need to understand what happens next," he added, his tone still even, still controlled. But there was something underneath it now, something more direct, less negotiable. "Not here." I hesitated. Of course I did. Every instinct I had was telling me to slow down, to question everything, to not let him keep setting the pace without resistance. But the truth was, he was right about one thing. This was not a conversation I could have in the middle of a crowded ballroom, with people watching every move we made. And people were watching. I could feel it again, the subtle glances, the curiosity, the quiet attention that had not faded even as the event continued around us. Walking away now, alone, would not go unnoticed. Walking away with him would reinforce everything he had just created. I hated how logical that was. I exhaled slowly, my mind running through the options one more time, even though I already knew which one I was going to choose. "Fine," I said, the word coming out quieter than I intended, but still firm enough to count. "But this is not me agreeing to anything beyond tonight." His gaze lingered on me for a fraction of a second, like he was evaluating that statement, deciding how much it actually meant, and then he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Understood," he said. I did not believe him. Not entirely. But it was enough to move forward. He glanced at his watch, precise, controlled, and then, without warning, his hand returned to my back again, guiding me gently toward the exit as if this was the most natural thing in the world. "Stay close," he murmured, repeating the instruction like it was something I needed to hear more than once. As we moved through the room, the attention followed, quieter now but still present, and I forced myself to match his pace, to mirror his composure, to act like I belonged next to him even though every part of me felt like I was standing in the wrong place at the wrong time in someone else's life. The doors came into view, tall and polished, leading out of the noise and into something unknown, and for a second, just a second, I hesitated. This was the point where I could still turn back, where I could step away, walk in the opposite direction, and deal with whatever consequences came with that choice. My chest tightened slightly at the thought, the uncertainty of it, the lack of control, the way it felt like stepping into something even more unpredictable than what I was already in. Nathaniel did not slow down. He did not look back. He simply kept moving, confident, certain, like he already knew I would follow. And that was the problem, because he was right. I took a step forward, then another, closing the distance again, falling into place beside him like I had already learned the role faster than I wanted to admit. As we reached the doors, he pushed them open with one smooth motion. The cool night air hitting immediately, sharp and grounding after the warmth of the ballroom. And just before we stepped outside completely, he leaned slightly closer, his voice low, "Meant only for me. Do not disappear," he said quietly. And something in the way he said it made it clear that was not just a suggestion. The cool night air hit harder than I expected, sharp and clean, cutting through the noise still echoing in my head. And for the first time since this entire thing started, I felt something close to clarity, like stepping outside had snapped me out of whatever controlled chaos he had pulled me into. I stopped just a step past the doors, my body instinctively pausing even as his hand remained at my back, steady, expectant, like he had no intention of stopping at all. Of course he did not. "Wait," I said, the word coming out more breath than sound, but enough to make him slow, just slightly. just enough for me to catch up with my own thoughts. This was moving too fast. Everything about this was moving too fast. I turned toward him, the city lights reflecting faintly off the glass behind us, and for a second, without the crowd, without the noise, it was different. Quieter. More real. More dangerous. You do not get to keep doing that, I said, my voice steadier now, grounded in the fact that we were no longer being watched the same way, that I could push back without an audience dissecting every reaction. His gaze shifted to me fully, attentive, focused, like I had just become the only thing in his line of sight. Doing what? He asked, calm as ever, which somehow made it worse. I let out a short breath, frustrated, because he knew exactly what I meant. Of course he did. Deciding everything. I clarified, gesturing slightly between us, the situation, the entire mess. Pulling me into things without warning, setting the pace, expecting me to just follow along like I do not have a say in any of it. The words came out sharper than I intended, but I did not take them back. I could not. Not now. Not when I had already let this go too far without pushing back enough. For a moment, he did not respond, his expression unreadable, but there was something there now, something more present than before, like he was actually considering what I said instead of just calculating the next step in his plan. You agreed, he said finally, not defensive, not dismissive, just stating a fact. I exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to argue that agreement under pressure was not exactly the same thing as a free choice. But I also knew that line would not get me anywhere right now. I agreed to 6 weeks. I corrected, meeting his gaze directly, refusing to let that detail blur. Not to being dragged through this without understanding what is happening. That seemed to land differently. Subtle, but noticeable. His posture shifted just slightly, less forward, less imposing, not stepping back, but not pushing in either. And for the first time since this started, it felt like the space between us was not entirely controlled by him. Then ask, he said. That was not what I expected. I blinked at him, thrown off just enough to hesitate. Ask, he repeated, his voice still calm. But there was something new in it now, something more direct, less calculated. If you do not understand something, ask. I will answer. I studied him for a second, trying to decide if that was real or just another part of the strategy, another way to keep control while making it look like I had some. But there was no obvious sign either way. Just that steady gaze, waiting, always waiting. Fine. I said finally, testing it, because at this point, testing things felt like the only way to stay even partially grounded. Why me? The question came out simpler than everything else, but it carried more weight than anything I had asked so far, because this was the part that did not make sense, the part that had been sitting in the back of my mind since the moment he walked across that ballroom like he already knew exactly where he was going. His expression did not change immediately, but the pause this time was different. Longer. Real. And then he said, because you were not trying to be noticed. I frowned slightly, the answer not lining up with anything I expected. That is your reason. I pressed, skeptical, because that sounded too vague, too convenient. His gaze held mine, steady, certain. Everyone else in that room was, he continued. You were not. I did not know what to do with that. It was not flattering. It was not insulting. It was just true. And somehow, that made it more unsettling than anything else he could have said. A car pulled up smoothly at the curb in front of us, black, polished, silent, like it had been waiting this entire time, and Nathaniel's attention shifted briefly before returning to me. We will continue this conversation inside, he said, his tone leaving little room for argument, but not as sharp as before, not as absolute. I hesitated for half a second, just long enough to feel the weight of stepping into something I still did not fully understand, and then I moved. Because at this point, walking away felt just as dangerous as staying. The car door opened before I could second-guess it, smooth and quiet like everything else about his world. And for a moment, I just stood there, staring at the dark interior like it was some kind of boundary I was about to cross, without fully understanding what waited on the other side. This was a terrible idea. Objectively, logically, every reasonable part of my brain was saying the same thing, loud and clear. And yet, I still stepped in. The seat was softer than anything I was used to, the faint scent of leather and something subtle, clean, wrapping around me as the door closed with a muted click that felt far more final than it should have. Nathaniel slid in after me, the movement controlled, unhurried, like there was no urgency because everything was already exactly where he wanted it. The car started moving almost immediately, pulling away from the curb with barely a sound. And just like that, the city outside shifted into motion, lights blurring past the tinted windows while the inside remained quiet. Too quiet. I exhaled slowly, my hands resting against my knees, trying to ground myself in something familiar, something real, but there was nothing about this that felt normal anymore. So, I said finally, breaking the silence because if I did not, I was going to overthink this entire situation into something even worse. This is the part where you explain everything. My voice was steadier than I expected, which was probably the only small victory I had tonight. Nathaniel glanced at me, not surprised, not annoyed, just expectant, like he had been waiting for me to say that. Yes, he said simply, because apparently he did not believe in unnecessary words. I resisted the urge to roll my eyes, barely. Then start with the part you skipped, I added, turning slightly toward him, forcing myself to hold his gaze even though it was still unnerving how focused it felt, how intentional. What exactly was the problem you needed to solve tonight? That seemed like a reasonable place to begin. His expression did not change much, but there was a subtle shift again, that quiet recalibration I was starting to recognize as him deciding how much to tell me and how to say it. There were negotiations happening tonight, he said, his tone calm, measured, like he was explaining something routine instead of something that had clearly required this level of intervention. A potential partnership. High value. High visibility. I nodded slightly, following, because that part made sense. Corporate deals, investors, image. That was his world. And something went wrong. I guessed, because otherwise we would not be here. His gaze flickered for just a second, enough to confirm it without him saying it outright. An opposing party introduced a narrative, he continued, his words precise, deliberate, like each one had been chosen carefully. One that would have raised questions about my stability, my priorities, and by extension, the company's direction. I frowned slightly, trying to piece it together. Your stability. I repeated, not quite understanding. What does that even mean? This time, there was the faintest hint of something that almost resembled irritation, not directed at me, but at the situation itself. Personal rumors, he clarified. Manufactured. Time to disrupt the negotiation. That clicked faster than I wanted it to. So you needed something to counter it, I said slowly, the realization settling in as I spoke. Something that would redirect attention before it gained traction. His gaze met mine again, steady, confirming without needing to say it outright. And suddenly, everything made a little too much sense. The timing, the audience, the way he moved so quickly, so decisively, like he had already weighed the options and chosen the most effective one without hesitation. Me. I let out a quiet breath, leaning back slightly against the seat as I processed that, the reality of it settling in heavier than before. So, I was the solution, I said, not quite asking, not quite accusing, just stating it. For what it was. He did not deny it. You were effective, he corrected, and somehow that was worse, because it made it sound intentional, like I had not just been convenient, but chosen. I looked at him for a long second, trying to understand how that was supposed to make me feel, and failing completely. And now we keep it going for 6 weeks, I said, more to confirm the plan than anything else, even though I already knew the answer. To stabilize the narrative, he replied. Of course, everything was about control, about managing perception, about shaping reality into something that worked in his favor. I stared out the window for a moment, watching the city lights blur together, trying to reconcile that with the fact that I was now part of that system, whether I liked it or not. And what happens if I mess it up? I asked quietly, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because that part mattered. Maybe more than anything else. The car remained silent for a second, the movement smooth, uninterrupted, and then Nathaniel spoke, his voice lower now, more direct. Then I will fix it. I turned back to him, my chest tightening slightly at how certain that sounded, how absolute. You say that like it is simple, I said, because nothing about this felt simple from where I was sitting. His gaze did not waver. It is, he replied. And for the first time since I met him, I realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. He was not worried about this going wrong. Not even a little. The certainty in his voice should not have bothered me as much as it did. But it did, settling somewhere under my ribs like a quiet warning I did not fully understand yet, because the way he said he would fix it did not sound like reassurance. It sounded like inevitability. I looked at him for a second longer than necessary, trying to read something in his expression, anything that suggested this situation had limits, but all I found was control. Complete, unwavering control. You really do not think anything about this can go wrong? I said, not quite a question, more like an observation I was still trying to wrap my head around. His gaze held mine, steady as ever. I think variables can be managed, he replied, which was not the same thing at all. I let out a quiet breath, leaning back slightly, my head resting against the seat for a moment as I stared at the ceiling, because apparently this was my life now, being treated like a variable in someone else's equation. That is not comforting, I muttered, more to myself than to him. But of course, he heard it anyway. He always did. The car slowed slightly as it turned, the city outside shifting again, brighter lights now, taller buildings, the kind of area where everything looked intentional, expensive, controlled. Just like him. I pushed myself upright again, refocusing, because if I was going to survive the next 6 weeks, I needed more than just a vague understanding of his plan. I needed details. Okay, I said, turning toward him again, more grounded this time, more deliberate. If this is going to work, I need to know exactly what you expect from me. That seemed reasonable, necessary. He studied me for a moment, that same quiet assessment, and then he nodded once, like he had already anticipated this question. Consistency, he said. That is the most important factor. Of course it was. Meaning, I prompted, because he had a habit of answering in single words that required further explanation. His expression remained composed, but his tone shifted slightly, more instructive now, less distant. Your behavior cannot contradict what was established tonight, he explained. You will attend events with me when required. You will respond to public interactions appropriately. You will not deny the relationship. I felt my chest tighten slightly at that last part, because hearing it said out loud made it more real, more binding than it had felt before. And privately, I added, because that part mattered just as much, if not more. What does that look like? For the first time since we got in the car, there was a pause that felt different. Not hesitation, not uncertainty, just consideration. Privately, he repeated, as if testing the word, and then his gaze shifted slightly, more focused, more direct. We establish a baseline. That did not clarify anything. A baseline? I echoed, frowning slightly. For what? His attention returned fully to me, sharper now, like this part mattered more than the rest. Familiarity, he said. That word landed differently than the others. Softer, but not less intentional. If this is to be believable, it cannot exist only in public, he continued. There has to be continuity, natural interaction, recognition of each other's habits, preferences, responses. I stared at him for a second, trying to process that, because what he was describing was not just a performance, it was something deeper, something that required more than just showing up and pretending for a few hours at a time. It required knowing him, and letting him know me. So you are saying, I started slowly, choosing my words carefully, we have to actually act like we know each other. His gaze did not waver. Yes. That was the problem. A very big problem. I let out a breath, running a hand through my hair again, the motion becoming a habit at this point, something to do while my brain tried to catch up. We do not know each other, I pointed out, because that felt like a very important detail he was conveniently overlooking. Then we fixed that, he said simply. Of course he did. Everything was something to fix. Adjust. Control. I shook my head slightly, half in disbelief, half in frustration. You make it sound easy, I said, because from where I was sitting, this was anything but. His expression softened just a fraction, not enough to change the overall impression, but enough to notice if you were paying attention. It is not easy, he said. That was new. I blinked, caught off guard by the honesty in that statement, because it was the first time he had acknowledged any level of difficulty in this entire situation. But it is necessary, he added, and just like that, the moment passed, replaced again by that same steady certainty. The car slowed to a stop, smooth and controlled, and I glanced out the window, realizing we had arrived somewhere I did not recognize, a building tall and sleek, glass reflecting the city lights like a mirror. My stomach tightened slightly again, that familiar sense of stepping into something unknown settling back in. Nathaniel reached for the door handle, then paused, just briefly, his gaze shifting to me one more time. "This is where we start," he said. And something in the way he said it made it clear this was not just about the plan anymore. The way he said "this is where we start" did not feel like a suggestion or even a step in a plan. It felt like a line being drawn, something I was about to cross whether I was ready or not. And judging by the way my chest tightened slightly, I was definitely not ready. Not even close. The door opened smoothly, and the cool night air slipped in again, but this time it felt different, heavier somehow, like it carried the weight of what came next instead of just clearing my head. Nathaniel stepped out first. Of course he did. Every movement controlled and deliberate. And for a second I stayed where I was, staring at the open door, at the reflection of city lights across polished glass, at the quiet certainty of a place that looked just as calculated as everything else about him. This was his world, and I was stepping into it. Again, I exhaled slowly and followed, because apparently that was what I did now, follow decisions that had already been made without me. The sidewalk was quiet compared to the chaos we left behind, the building towering above us with sharp lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that revealed almost nothing about what was inside. And as we moved toward the entrance, I became painfully aware of how out of place I still felt, like I had walked into the wrong story and had not figured out how to leave yet. The doors opened before we reached them, seamless, silent, and the lobby inside was exactly what I expected, clean, minimal, expensive in a way that did not need to announce itself. Everything in its place, everything controlled. Just like him. "This is your place," I said, more of a statement than a question as I stepped inside, my voice quieter in the open space, the sound of it echoing slightly against polished floors and high ceilings. "Yes," he replied, simple, direct, already moving forward like there was no need to linger on obvious facts. "Of course not." I followed again, my footsteps softer against the floor, my eyes taking in details without meaning to, the way everything seemed untouched, precise, like nothing here happened by accident. It made me feel even more out of place. The elevator opened immediately, like it had been waiting, and we stepped inside without a word, the doors closing behind us with a quiet finality that made the space feel smaller than it actually was. Too small. Too quiet. I shifted slightly, adjusting my stance, suddenly very aware of the distance between us, or rather the lack of it, because even without touching, his presence filled the space in a way that was hard to ignore. The elevator moved smoothly, the numbers climbing in silence, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. It was not awkward exactly, but it was not comfortable either. It was something else, something in between. "So this is the part where we get to know each other," I said finally, breaking the silence because it felt necessary, because if I did not say something, I was going to start overthinking everything again. He glanced at me, just briefly, acknowledging without interrupting. "You said we need familiarity." I continued, my voice steady, even though there was a tension underneath it I could not quite get rid of. "So where do we start? Do you have a list? A plan? A schedule?" The last word slipped out with a hint of dry humor, because at this point, it would not surprise me if he did. For a second, nothing changed, and then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth shifted. Not quite a smile, but close enough to register as something different from the complete neutrality I had seen all night. "No schedule," he said, his tone calm, but there was something lighter there now, something less rigid. That would be inefficient. I blinked at him, caught off guard by that response, because it was not what I expected, and before I could react, the elevator slowed, then stopped, the doors sliding open to reveal a space that looked even more private, more removed from everything else. He stepped out first again, and I followed, because apparently that part had not changed. The hallway was quiet, the lighting soft but precise, and when we reached the door at the end, he paused, just briefly, his hand resting on the handle before he looked back at me. Really looked this time. "We start with something simple," he said. My stomach tightened slightly at that, because nothing about this had been simple so far. He opened the door, stepping inside and leaving it open just enough for me to follow, and when I did, the space inside felt different. Still controlled, still precise, but quieter, more personal. I stepped in slowly, my eyes adjusting, my thoughts catching up, and before I could say anything, he spoke again, his voice steady, direct, but lower now, like this part mattered more. Tell me something real about you. And just like that, I realized this might be the most difficult part of all. For a second, I just stood there, staring at him like he had asked me the most unreasonable question in the world, because out of everything that had happened tonight, everything fast, calculated, overwhelming, this was the part that caught me off guard the most. Not the kiss, not the deal, not even the 6 weeks. This, something real. I repeated, my voice quieter now, slower, like I needed to hear it out loud to understand what he actually meant. He did not move, did not elaborate, just watched me with that same steady focus, like he was waiting to see what I would do when the control shifted, even slightly, in my direction. I let out a small breath, glancing away for a second, my eyes tracing the edges of the room, the clean lines, the carefully placed furniture, everything in its exact place. And it hit me that there was probably nothing in his life that was not intentional. Nothing unplanned. Nothing accidental. And now he was asking me to introduce something real into that. That felt unfair. You could have started with something easier, I muttered, more to myself than to him. But the silence that followed made it clear he was not going to let me avoid it. Of course he was not. I shifted slightly, crossing my arms before immediately uncrossing them again, because that felt too closed off, too defensive, and I hated that I was already overthinking something as simple as standing. This was exactly what he meant by consistency, I realized. If I could not even control my own reactions here, how was I supposed to do it out there? Fine, I said finally, the word coming out with a quiet exhale, more surrender than agreement. Something real. I paused, searching for something that was honest, but not too much, something that would satisfy the question without giving him more than I was ready to give. But the problem was, anything real automatically felt like too much. That was the point. I glanced at him again, and he had not moved. Not even. A little. Still watching. Still waiting. I hated that it made me feel seen. I do not like being the center of attention, I said, the words coming out more easily than I expected, probably because they were obvious, probably because he had already figured that out on his own. I avoid it whenever I can, which makes everything that happened tonight kind of a nightmare scenario. There was a faint shift in his expression, subtle, but present, like he was processing that, adding it to whatever internal system he used to understand people. He did not interrupt, did not comment, just listened. That should not have felt significant, but it did. I exhaled slowly, continuing before I could second-guess it. I like things that are predictable, I added, my voice steadier now, more grounded in something familiar. Not boring, just stable. I like knowing what to expect. I like having control over my own life. The last part landed heavier than I intended, the words lingering in the space between us, because we both knew how ironic that sounded right now. His gaze did not waver, but something about it changed, just slightly, like the information mattered more than the words themselves. And I do not trust situations that change too fast. I finished, quieter now, because that part felt closer to the truth than anything else I had said. The room went still again, the silence settling in differently this time, not empty, not uncomfortable, just present, real, in a way that the rest of the night had not been. Nathaniel studied me for a moment longer, and then, unexpectedly, he nodded once. Not approval, not dismissal, just acknowledgement. Noted, he said, his voice lower now, less detached than before, like he actually meant it. I blinked at him, slightly thrown off by how simple that was, how he did not analyze it out loud, did not twist it into something strategic, just accepted it and moved on. That is it, I asked, unable to stop myself, because I expected more. Questions. Follow-up. Something. He shook his head slightly. For now, he replied. Of course. For now. I let out a small breath, tension easing just a fraction, because that could have been worse. Much worse. But then he stepped closer. Not abruptly. Not aggressively. Just enough to shift the space again, to remind me that this was still happening, that this was still real. My turn, he said quietly, his gaze steady on mine, and for some reason, that made my pulse pick up again, sharp and immediate, because I suddenly realized something I had not considered before. If I had to be honest, then so did he. And I had no idea what that was going to look like. The shift in the air was immediate, subtle but undeniable, like something had tilted just slightly off balance. and suddenly I was not the only one being observed anymore. My turn. The words echoed in my head with a weight I did not expect, because up until now, everything about him had felt controlled, calculated, distant, like he existed behind a layer no one could reach, and the idea that he was about to step out from behind that, even just a little, felt significant. I did not move. I barely breathed. I just watched him, waiting, because for once, I was not the one trying to keep up. For once, the silence belonged to him. Nathaniel held my gaze for a moment longer, and then, very slightly, something in his expression shifted, not enough to call it soft, not enough to make it easy to read, but enough to know that whatever he was about to say was not part of the performance. "I do not like unpredictability," he said finally, his voice lower now, steadier, but without the sharp edge it usually carried. That alone was unexpected. I blinked, processing, because that sounded almost similar. Not the same, but close enough to notice. He took a slow breath, his posture still composed, but there was a tension there now, something quieter, more internal. "I prefer control," he continued, and that part, at least, did not surprise me. That part was obvious. I structure outcomes. I anticipate variables. I eliminate risk whenever possible. I let out a quiet breath, a small, almost automatic reaction, because that was exactly how he had approached everything tonight, every decision, every movement, every word. It was not just who he was. It was how he functioned. And when something disrupts that, he added, his gaze not leaving mine, I correct it. There it was again. That certainty, that unwavering belief that everything could be managed, adjusted, fixed. But this time, it did not feel as distant. This time, it felt closer, more personal. "Tonight was not part of the plan," he said, and that caught me off guard completely, because for the first time since this started, he was admitting something had not gone the way he expected. I frowned slightly, trying to reconcile that with everything I had seen so far. It looked like it was. I pointed out quietly, because from where I was standing, everything he did had seemed intentional, seamless. He shook his head once, a small, precise movement. The response was, he clarified. The situation was not. That made more sense than I wanted it to. I studied him for a second, noticing the way his shoulders held just a fraction tighter than before, the way his focus did not waver but felt more deliberate, like he was choosing every word instead of letting them come automatically. This was different. Subtly, but undeniably different. "I do not involve other people in variables I cannot fully control," he continued, and something about that made my chest tighten slightly, because I already knew where this was going. "And yet," I said before I could stop myself, my voice quieter now, more careful, "you involved me." The words hung there, not accusatory, not confrontational, just real. His gaze sharpened slightly at that, but he did not look away, did not deflect. "Yes," he said simply, just like that. No hesitation, no excuse. I swallowed, the weight of that answer settling deeper than I expected, because it meant something. I just did not know what yet. "Why?" I asked, the question softer this time, not demanding, just trying to understand. There was a pause, a real one, longer than any of the others. And then, quietly, he said, "Because you were the only variable in that room that did not react to me." That was not what I expected, not even close. I frowned slightly, trying to process that, replaying the moment in my head, the way I had looked away, tried to disappear, tried not to be noticed. "That is your reason," I said slowly, because it sounded too simple for something this complicated. His gaze held mine, steady, certain, but there was something else there now, something I had not seen before, something less controlled. "No," he said, just as quietly. A pause. And then, "It is the reason I chose you." The air shifted. Again, heavier this time. The space between us feeling smaller without either of us moving, and I realized something in that moment that I had been trying not to think about since the beginning. This was not just about the plan anymore. Not entirely. I held his gaze, my pulse picking up again, sharp and unsteady, because whatever this was turning into, it was not something I could predict. And that, more than anything else, should have made me step back. It should have made me walk away. But I did not.